Now, the way in which we can render these out and play with them in real time is to set up a very simple composite. So what we're going to do is we're going to isolate some of the lights and we're going to render them separately to an HDR format and play with them in a compositing software. In this case, we're going to use Digital Fusion. So in order to do that, let's just render out just a couple of passes here that we can start playing with in Digital Fusion. So first of all, we want to be able to have the sky in our background, and we don't want to, when we make adjustments to the lighting, affect the sky. So we want that to be a separate piece. So let's go ahead and just render the sky. Okay, so here's the sky rendered. It's just all by itself. So let's go ahead and we'll save this out. And since we're not going to be making any adjustments to the sky, I'm not going to save it in high dynamic range format. So we'll just call this environment sky and save that as a targa. We don't need to have it be 32-bit, but I usually just get in the habit of leaving these settings as they are. So let's just leave that. And the next thing we're going to do is we're done with the sky. So let's just turn the environment back on, or at least part of it, while we set stuff up. And we're going to turn on the dome light. Now what we need to do is we need to make sure that this light is brighter than we'll ever really need it to be. So I'm just going to crank this up to 3. And we're going to store the alpha channel. We don't need to have normal checked for this, so these settings right here will give us what we need. We say OK, and then we render this out. Alright, so 3.5 minutes later we have our ambient pass, which was rendered a little bit over bright, and now we need to do the same thing for just the key light by itself. So we'll turn the key light on, and we're going to change this to key and save it, and now we'll render this. And here's the result. Now just so you know, I also turned up the key light so that it was also over bright from what we know it's going to need to be. And here's the result of that. It took about 50 seconds to render. So now we've got these 3 passes. Let's go into Digital Fusion and let's set them up and start playing with the lighting in real time. So here in Digital Fusion, what we're going to do is we're going to create a brand new flow. Okay, and what we'll do now is we're going to start with just a background. Now I'm going to also pull in the passes that we just rendered, and we can do that just by dragging and dropping them in here. Okay, now we're going to layer these up in the order of whatever was furthest back to whatever's closest to the camera. So I'm just going to kind of position these in that order, with the background being the furthest thing back. So first thing we need to do is take a look at how big we rendered these. It was 720x486. So we'll select the background, and we're going to make sure that this is also 720x486. So if we drag this up here, I'm going to set this to fit so we can see what we're doing better. We get just a black background. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag a merge down here, and we're going to connect the background to it first and then the sky second. And if we drag this up and drop it in here, we now get our sky. And we're going to just do that all the way down here. So we're going to merge, we're going to connect this one, and then the ambient, drag it on top, and we'll do the same thing, only we're going to do something slightly different here. I'm going to put this merge on here, and you do that by holding down Shift and then dragging and dropping on top of the line. And I'm going to connect the key to this merge now. And what you'll see uh, is that the key pass is blocking out the ambient pass. So what we need to do to make this look like a max render that would have both lights turned on is to select this merge, and we're going to turn the alpha gain all the way down. This is just turning off the alpha channel in a sense, and leaving us with these two images with the key on top of the ambient being additively put on top. So what we can do now, if we want to adjust the lighting in real time, is we can take a color correct, and we're going to just drop one onto the ambient, and we're going to drop another one onto the key. And let's just for a second look at the ambient pass by itself. If we now take the gain and start dropping it, we're adjusting the brightness of that light in real time now. And the same thing happens if we do it in here. We're not just clamping the image at 255. This contains a lot more information. So when we actually change this value, this is exactly what it would look like in max if we rendered with these values. So now all we have to do is start playing with these and getting them where we want them to go, like whatever looks best. So want to get some more contrast into our shadows, and I want the light or the sun to be brighter. Maybe something like this. And so there we've just adjusted the lights in real time and do all of this stuff later on. We render those passes once, bring them in to Fusion, adjust the lighting, and now we'll take that information, put it right back into Max. Because if you were to do this on much more complicated shots, you're just going to have a bigger and bigger and more complex Fusion comp, which is fine, but it will take longer to render out the frames, and it's not necessary. If you can adjust it here, then just put it right back into Max. So what we'll do is we'll see we've got 0.53 is what we have for the gain for our ambient pass. Now we had set in Max our ambient light, if we select it again, we'd set it to 3. So basically we're going to multiply 3 by 0.53. So we'll hit Control N, and we've got 3 times 0.53, and it brings us to 1.6. And then if we select the key light, it was at 2.5, and in here we adjusted it to 0.588. So we'll do the same thing here and go 2.5 times 0.588. And now if we were to render these together, we should get something that looks identical. So let's go ahead and do that, and we'll just compare it and make sure that it does. So here's the render with all those lights adjusted to match what we did in Fusion. And I'm just going to save this out as max render TGA. And let's take it into Digital Fusion, and we'll just compare it. So what I'll do is I'll just pull this over here and turn this on, and now we can compare. They are awfully similar. Now we're not getting the reflections of the sky, remember, because we didn't have it turned on, but we can actually very easily add that to our ambient pass, or just render it all by itself in a reflection pass. lighting passes like this. So just like that, by rendering each light separately just one time, we were able to set up the lighting for this shot uh, in a matter of minutes. I think it probably took a total of 15 minutes, and we didn't have to tweak a light once. So this is an excellent way to set up your lighting for your scenes. It's a huge time saver. So in this example, we rendered to RLA format, which supports floating point information. And it's really important that we do that. Now, it doesn't have to be an RLA. You can use any format that supports floating point, like EXR, RPFs, HDR. Any of those will support floating point information. But example here, just so you can see the difference. So I'm going to do is I'm going to render just the key, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to crank this up to like 10. So this is going to be extremely bright. So let's render this. And here's the result of that render. So as you can see, it is really bright. But let's go ahead and save this as key clamped. And I'm going to save this just as a TGA file. And we're going to do the same thing. Float. And now we'll render this out. And here's that render. It's identical, but it only looks identical right now. Let's take it into Fusion again, and we'll turn this back off. And I'm just going to bring those two passes in here, and we'll look at them. So here's the clamped one, and here's the floating point one. So they're pretty much identical, very close. What we're going to do is put the color correct on each of these. I'm just going to copy and paste. Okay, and now let's turn this back on actually. So this is the floating point, this is the clamped. So if I now take this and I turn the gain down, that bright white shade is just turning gray. And that's because this image is clamped. We're just taking, what was white, 255, and just dragging it down until it's black, 0. So we don't have any sort of range in here. But if we were to do the same thing on this floating point image, watch as all the detail comes back. So all that information is actually stored of a light in Max. And that's why it's necessary that you use these floating point formats if you're going to set up your lighting in a comp like this. So clearly, these floating point formats much more information. These RLA files can get much bigger than a typical target file of the same thing. So you're going to have to deal with much bigger file sizes. So I would recommend EXRs over RLAs. But some of the other things you need to watch out for is this floating point format doesn't just natively support motion blur. You can't use image motion blur with these formats. You need to save out a velocity channel, which is going to make these files a little bit bigger. And then Digital Fusion does not natively support velocity channels, so you would need to have a third-party plugin to be able to get motion blur with this. So because I like to work and have the freedom of using any renderer that I want, you know, file, because that way I can use image motion blur or any of Max's motion blurs types and still be able to composite everything together from different renderers and have it all line up nicely. Okay, so I've gone ahead and I just deleted out those extra nodes that we're using just as examples, and we're back to just our basic comp now. So let's get back into Max and let's look at how to render out passes that we can composite back together to get our final image. So back in Max, we've got the environment and the stone edge turned on, which is all we've been working with so far. But let's render out, we had mountains, so let's render those out. So we'll turn off everything except our mountain layer because we'd like to be able to control that separately in our final comp. And here it is, it's just mapped onto a cylinder. So let's render this. And here is that render. So it's just our mountains with the alpha in there. And we're going to save this out into this folder. And we'll call this just environment mountains TGA. 32-bit, compress, and pre-multiply. So we've got this pass now. The next thing that we're going to do is we'll render out our environment lighting passes again, and this time we're going to render them as targas. And we've already adjusted their multipliers based on what we had figured out in our comp by turning these or multiplying the multiplier that we had in Max by this value to get the final light multiplier that we want to render out with. Wow, that was a mouthful. Anyways, we'll turn the environment back on, stone edge, and the dome light. Now, in our comp, we don't have the sky reflected in the water, and we could set this up so that we have the water reflection element separate so we can adjust it all by itself. But since we're really not planning on doing a whole lot to the reflection here, there's no real reason to render it out separately. What we can do, since we already have the ambient level set up so that later on when we put it back in here we don't have to adjust it really, what we can do is just render the sky reflected in the water in our ambient pass, and we'll just have it there and we won't need to render out another pass for it. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the sky, and what I'm going to do is we need to make this invisible to camera. Now you can do it by just going to properties and turning off visible to camera, and that's going to allow it to render in the reflection but not show up in the scene when it renders. But the way I normally do this, and you can set it up that way, is using the onion tool. We can define alternate properties, and I've set mine to visible to camera, and the alternate property state would be off. And so whenever I toggle this on and off, it's turning the visibility to camera of this object on and off. So now it's set off and we can render our scene just like this and get our ambient pass with the sky reflected in the water. And here is that render, and as you can see the sky is reflected in the water but does not show up in the alpha or in the rendered background here. So we'll take this and we're just going to save this as the environment ambient TGA. I'm overwriting this one because my computer was nice enough to crash, so I had saved it out before, but we're going to save over it again and I'm going to backtrack a little bit. So here we've got that. and we need to do the same thing and render out our key pass. But this time, since we already have the sky information, we're going to turn it off and just render just our key light. And here's the render of our key pass. And once again, the sky is not present here or in the reflection. So we'll save this out. It's going to be environment key TGA. Alright, so we have our sky pass, we have our mountain pass, we have the ambient light pass with the sky and the reflection, and we also have our key light pass. So we have everything that we need to set up just our basic flow again. So building off of what we already have, we've got the sky, but we need to have the mountains. So we'll drag this pass in, and we'll need a merge. And we're going to put it on top of the sky but below the background, and it just drops right in. And we have our environment ambient and our environment key pass now in Targa format, so we can blow away this stuff and just pipe these back in, and we should get the exact same thing. And so now we've got pretty much all that we need for this render. We can continue to add more in here. Right now we don't have any fog, so we could render that out separately and put that in. But what if we needed to change the colors of something in here? If we had to change the color of the wall here because maybe the art director didn't like uh, if you're fairly confident that your colors and everything are the way you want them, then rendering this method isn't too bad. In fact, I do this sort of setup a lot. But if you are expecting to need to tweak colors a lot, what you might want to do is consider an ambient occlusion pass. And let's go back into Max, and remember I had said that we would be coming back to this Omni light, this ambient Omni light. Now, the key pass renders pretty fast by itself, and this ambient only light renders pretty fast by itself. So let's go ahead and set up how we would do an ambient occlusion pass, and I'll show you how that can be really beneficial if you want to change something later on, like colors, in the comp. Alright, so we've already got the key pass. So what we need to do is render a pass of this ambient only light. So let's go ahead and we'll do that. And I'm going to turn the sky back on again. So we'll render this. And here's that render, and you can see 50 seconds is much faster. So if we needed to re-render stuff several times to tweak it, it would be much easier to do so and take less time. So let's save this out, and let's call this environment ambient only. And now what we need to do is render an ambient occlusion pass. So what I like to use is the mental ray occlusion shader. So let's go ahead and we'll switch our renderer over to mental ray. So we'll come down here, assign renderer, mental ray. I'm just going to use 1 and 16 for the anti-aliasing for now. And let's set up the shader. So we'll come in here and we're going to choose mental ray as our material type, and I'm going to put in the surface part of this ambient reflective occlusion. So now what we need to do is the type is 0, which is what we want. We want occlusion, so that's good. And this actually the default settings are probably going to be just fine for this. So let's go ahead and we'll call this metal ray occlusion. And what we're going to do is we're going to enable the material override, and I'm just going to drop it in there as an instance. Now, when we render, everything in the scene is going to just be given this material. So we don't need any lights. We can turn that off. And we don't need our sky dome. What we do need to do is to go into the environment, and we're going to change our background color to white now. And we can go ahead and just render this. And here's the result of that render. Now this is basically the same as taking the mental ray sky light that we were using, that dome light, making it white and making all of the objects in the scene shade of white. And when we render that, we'd get pretty much the same thing. But this allows us to do it all within a shader and not have to have any lights in the scene. So what we'll do is we'll save this out, environment occlusion, and let's go back into Digital Fusion now. So I'm going to just copy and paste this for a second, and we'll come over here. So we need to have our ambient only. All we need to do is we'll take our ambient pass and we're going to put a merge, and we're going to put this in first. We're going to put the occlusion on top of it, and then we're going to change this type to multiply, and we're also going to turn off the alpha. Completely flexible now. We can do whatever we want with it. And then say you had gotten that set the way you want it, we can then do just as before and turn the alpha gain down, and now we can set up our light rig in this using this sort of workflow, and that'll allow us to again make renders where we're changing materials a lot faster. But we do have a problem with this method. In fact, we have several problems. One, you'll notice the lamp. Occlusion does not work well with transparent objects. In fact, it doesn't work at all. And we have the same problem with reflections too. This should be reflecting in the water, and it's not. So this method for our situation, since we have transparency, we have reflections, and the leaves that were on the water, they also are opacity mapped cards. We're actually going to be better off using this method. But I just wanted to show you that you can use this sort of occlusion method. In this situation, it's not going to be the best for us. So we'll go back to using our previous method of just the ambient and the key. So one of the things that we're missing now, which we should probably add, is a little bit of atmospheric haze, some depth fog. So let's go ahead and we'll render out a fog pass that we can put in here. So back in Max now, we're going to turn off the lights. We don't need any lights. And what we're going to do is we'll go to the environment panel and we'll come down here to fog. I had already created one from before, but all you would do is add fog and then you'd be here. So we're going to make this active. I'm going to leave fog background on. There's times when you may or may not want to do this, but I'm going to leave it on for now. And I'm going to change this far value and make it really dense. We'll make it 90. And I'm going to turn on exponential. I usually just do this by default. Anytime that you're going to render something that has opacity maps, you're going to want to turn this on. So I've just gotten in the habit of always leaving it on. So we've got the fog set up now. And what we'll do is, actually we want to check and just, alright, we are rendering on black background, that's what we want. So we should be able to just render this out now. Although one of the things that we should look at first is the camera. So we'll select the camera and I want to check our environment ranges. This near and far value, they coincide with the near and far in the fog path, or in the atmospheric fog. So if we scroll down here, the near value here and the far here correlate with these two. So wherever this distance is from the camera, that's where it'll finally be this 90%. Here's our camera, and let's just select it. And let's look at the environment range. It's this line right here. So the near value is 0, and the far value we're adjusting right here. So 325 is cool. I'd already set this up before, but you would just change this value until it kind of encompassed as much of the scene as you needed it to. So that's what I've done here. So now we're all set up and we can render this. So let's do a test render. And here's the result that we get. And this is exactly what we want. What I didn't bother rendering out, like making this a matte material, and if we had done that, we wouldn't be getting the reflections that we are now. So I left all of the original materials on these objects, and when I render, that allows me to get fog in the reflection on the water, which is exactly what we want. Now, one of the things that you need to consider when you do this is that all of these buildings here, we don't really need the material on them. They're not doing anything. They're basically black because we don't have any lights turned on in the scene. If something in here was self-illuminated, then we'd have a problem. So if you're using plants or card objects that have self-illumination, you could not render like this. You would have to set up some alternate materials. And actually, when you start working on bigger and bigger scenes where memory is an issue, it would be a really good idea if you separated some of these objects apart from the water, which you need the reflection. But all these buildings, you could give them just a black material. And that way, when you're rendering, you're not loading all the texture maps, and you'll ultimately get a faster render. Since this scene isn't really all that complex, I'm not going to worry about it. But if you're dealing with big scenes, you should do that. It'll make your life a lot easier. So let's go ahead and we'll render this out at full resolution, and then we'll put it into our comp. So here's the result of that render, and let's go ahead and just save this out. We'll call it environment.fog, just like that. And now over in Fusion, what we'll do is we'll load this in, and we'll put it on top of everything. So I'm going to put a merge and then this, and I'll drag this up. And as you can see, it's on top of everything now. So we go ahead and let's look at the alpha channel. And what we need to do is we want to create a different alpha channel. We don't want to use this one. We want to use, because remember, this is only 90% because we didn't have that value go all the way up. So we're getting white in the alpha here, but here it's only 90%. So what we want to do is we want to use this as our alpha. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, I'm going to add a tool, and I'm going to choose the mean. So now this is a little bit too intense. So let's go ahead and before the Luma keyer, what I'm going to do is I'll put a color correct on here. And what we can do is go to levels and we can just drag this down, and that's going to affect the amount of fog that we have, although it's also affecting the color just slightly. And so here you can see we can adjust how much fog we have in real time. Now I could have just found the value that worked well and just rendered it out, changing our values in max. If we had gone in here and just said, okay, instead of 90, I don't need it to be that strong, I'll just make it 15 or 20. You could do that. There's no problem with that. But what's nice about having almost an entire full range from 0 to 90 here, this allows you to do some depth of field cheating, and you could use this to control saturation so that as stuff went off into the distance, you could tint it and change the saturation, and you can do just all sorts of good stuff with a pass like this. This is almost like a Z-depth pass. So that's why I usually render it out like this and get the full range, and that and then I'll clamp it down to what I need. But it just gives me some room to play with this.